Welcome to the Property Care Association's presentation, Invasive Weeds in the Countryside, from Hemlock to Hogweed, in support of the Invasive Species Awareness Week. My name is Robert Mitchell, and I'm a Director of Conservation Land Services Limited. I'm also a PCA examiner and contributor to the book, Practical Management of Invasive Non-Native Weeds in Britain and Ireland. I have over a decade of field experience as a surveyor, and I'm particularly keen to try and promote a wider awareness of invasive weeds and plants beyond just Japanese knotweed. So, invasive weeds in the countryside, the umbellifers, or sometimes known as the carrot family. In the last few years, there has been a good success in creating a general awareness of Japanese knotweed, what it looks like, and the hazards it represents. This cannot be said for the umbellifers, which is strange really, because I cannot think there is a single gardener in the country who at some stage has not had a significant problem trying to control ground elder, which is an umbellifer, is part of the umbellifer family. And indeed, Japanese knotweed will do a number of things, but one thing it will not do is put you in hospital, whereas some of the umbellifers will, and in some extreme cases, can kill. For example, giant hogweed, this can cause severe blistering. And the hemlocks, these are really very toxic indeed. And then there's the flood risk and habitat loss represented by floating pennywort. And I'm sure many of you will already know, Japanese knotweed, one of the things we don't have to worry about is seed production, because we don't have the male plant in this country. We only have the female plant. So as a result, it doesn't produce viable seeds. Whereas with the umbellifers, this can represent quite a serious risk to spread on your land. For example, giant hogweed can produce tens of thousands of seeds per plant per year. So it's clear, as landowners and managers or contractors involved with invasive weed control, we really do need to be aware of this family and to know what to look for and the hazards they present to not only our own land, but maybe even our neighbour's land. Because left alone, it can result in a significant loss of income through the potential damages from people being hospitalised, the loss of livestock, the loss of amenity use, and habitat value. Because the longer we leave it, the more expensive this problem is going to become. And as you can see down here, there's a graph here called the typical exponential growth of alien invasive weeds. And it's a graph that maybe some of you have seen before. But the key point about this is it shows how a delay in the control of invasive weeds can result in a massive explosion in not only the growth of the plant involved on your land, but the consequential costs as well. So it's clear that we have to be reactive to invasives because delay costs money and loss of habitat. So this video, we're looking to introduce you to the umbellifer family, make you aware of the umbellifers on the Wildlife and Countryside Act as amended 1981, and to help you to identify 4 of the major costly and troublesome umbellifers. So, the umbellifer family. This is quite a large family with over 3,000 species, and it's also really a very diverse family. You can go from the health-enhancing cumins and fennels and corianders to the hazards presented by giant hogweed and the hemlocks. Quite apart from the sheer beauty of the delicate clouds of white blossom gracing our roadside verges through the cow parsley. All of the plants within this family look really very similar, and so ID can be quite difficult. But it is clear that correct identification is critical, because in this family, we've got some really very invasive plants, and on top of that, some of them are also highly toxic. And within the family, we've got some natives, and we've got some non-natives, and indeed some honorary natives. But of the non-natives, 5 of them are on the Wildlife and Countryside Act as amended 1981. So what makes an umbellifer an umbellifer? Well, umbellifers have collections of often quite small and delicate flowers held on stalks, held together in a collection that looks like an umbrella or a disc, which I hope you can see there in the image on the top left there, which is of giant hogweed as it happens. But I'm hoping you can see it's quite a distinctive umbrella or disc shape. And these are referred to as umbels. And some of the clues we can help to use identify between the umbellifers are the color of the flowers, the size and shape of the seeds, the shape of the leaves, and in some cases, distinctive purple spots on the stems, such as with hemlock, and also whether or not the stem is hairy or hairless. So why should we be bothered about the umbellifers? Well, I've already mentioned some of them are extremely toxic, but on top of that, 5 of them are on the Wildlife and Countryside Act as amended 1981, which is the very same list that Japanese knotweed is on. And these are giant hogweed, Persian hogweed, Sosnovsky's hogweed, floating pennywort, and perfoliate alexanders. Now, the 4 that we're going to look at today are giant hogweed, because that causes major skin blisters, hemlock, because that's poisonous, hemlock water dropwort, also very poisonous, and floating pennywort, because this represents a major flood risk and habitat loss. So the first plant we're going to have a look at is giant hogweed. Now, you can see there some poor unfortunate soul there with some really very significant blistering on their skin. And that's come about because they have come in contact with the plant. And the plant is phototoxic. And what that means, it causes severe blistering when exposed to UV light. And it can be so severe that you can end up in hospital with it. And beyond that, it will carry on causing this reaction for 1 or 2 years after the initial event, which is really quite tragic. Giant hemlock is predominantly found by water bodies, but not exclusively. And you can see there in the lower image, there's an example of a giant hogweed on a field side edge. It's a biennial, so it spends the first year growing, and then somewhere between the 2nd and the 5th year, it reaches flowering. And it's at this point that the major spread risk comes on board, because each plant can produce tens of thousands of seeds per plant per year. So it's clear preventing that flowering is critical when looking at the control of giant hogweed. And as I've already said, it presents a major risk to health in addition to the loss of habitat, because it is really quite invasive. And in fact, if you don't get on top of those first few plants, you can quite quickly find yourself with several hundred in a very short period of time. And of course, it reduces the amenity value and biodiversity of water bodies. And if you are in ownership of land that has fishing rights or boating, it prevents people from getting to the water because of this major health risk. So what are some of the things we can use to help us identify giant hogweed? Well, some of it's in the clue is in the name, actually. It is absolutely gigantic. The plant can be up to 5 meters tall, and it has hollow stems, which are quite big. You know, they're 5 to 10 centimeters, and they have hairs and this purple speckling, which I hope you can see in the image there. And the umbels can be equally huge. They can be 80 centimeters across with these small white flowers. And then there are the leaves, which are really quite distinctive. They're quite dramatic, actually. They can be up to 1 meter in length, and they're really quite spiky and jagged, as you can see there. And that can be really very helpful, because when you're monitoring your land, it can be quite, once you've got your eye in, it can become relatively easy to quickly identify whether or not you've got giant hogweed. For example, you can see there in the image on the lower right, I've circled 2 plants. The one on the left with the blue arrow is common hogweed, and you can see on the right with the red arrow is giant hogweed, and it's really quite distinctive. And it's clearly important that we get the ID correct, because we don't want to be spending time and money controlling common hogweed. And then later on in the year, when you get to the seed production, quite ironically, when you've got such a gigantic plant with gigantic umbels and gigantic leaves, the seeds themselves are really quite small and papery thin, with a very distinctive dark stripes on there, which I hope you can see. So the next plant we're going to have a look at is hemlock, which really is very poisonous indeed. And in fact, is the plant that was recorded to have killed Socrates. And the hemlock is a really good example of where a general lack of awareness and no particular action to control it can result in a massive spread of the plant. And I'm involved in a number of moderately large-scale surveys, and I don't always come across Japanese knotweed, but I absolutely always come across hemlock. There has been quite a significant explosion in hemlock in this country over the last few years. And once you get your eye in, when you're driving around, you'll quickly see it along the roadsides everywhere. So what can we use to help us identify this plant? Because it's clearly important that we have an awareness that it's on our land, because it is very toxic and represents a risk to health for those using your land. Well, it has quite a distinctive zigzag stem, which I hope you can see there on the right, which is an example of what the cane looks like in the winter. But don't confuse this with Japanese knotweed. Japanese knotweed also has this zigzag stem, but there are a number of things that we can look at to help us distinguish between hemlock and Japanese knotweed. One, of course, is the leaves. You can see there's these rather delicate fern-like leaves. It stands about 2.5 meters tall, and it has these really very pretty white flowers. And the stems are hollow and green and hairless, but they have this very distinctive purple speckling, and that purple speckling can be really very useful in trying to get an initial ID on whether or not what you're looking at is hemlock. And then in the winter, you get these rigid white canes with black spots on them, and those black spots are the remains of the purple speckling. And you can see an example there on the right. And the next plant we're going to have a look at is hemlock water dropwort. Now, this is considered by many to be the most poisonous plant in the UK. And so it's clearly very important that as landowners or people responsibility for land, we really get to know this one very well indeed, because it is fatal to both people and livestock. And it's relatively common, but you will find it along waterways, ponds, and ditches, as the name suggests, hemlock water dropwort. And it is sometimes, sadly, confused for wild celery or wild parsnip, but that's obviously not a mistake to make, because it is really quite fatal. And in fact, a long time ago in history was sadly used to execute prisoners. And an unfortunate victim would end up with an extreme smile on their face, which was referred to as a sardonic grin, potentially from victims from Sardinia. So how are we going to identify hemlock water droplort? Well, it flowers between June to August, and it has these rather pretty little white flowers, and the umbels are about 5 to 10 centimeters across. The plant itself can grow to about 1.5 meters, and it has hollow, rounded, hairless stems, and unlike the hemlock water droplort does not have the purple speckling. And the leaves look a little bit like celery, and this three pinnate is referred to as pinnate division. So it's this distinctive 3 pinnate leaves, and it looks a little bit like celery, but it's more rounded perhaps. And the stems there, can you see there are these grooves going along the stems? And in the winter, it can be quite a good time to have a look and to check along your land anywhere around water, because when a lot of things are not really active at all, or in some cases have died down, such as Himalayan balsam, which dies down, the hemlock water dropwort remains active, and you can see these quite distinctive bright green leaves along the water's edge. And if dug up, it has these white swollen roots, which are appropriately referred to as dead man's fingers. And then a further thing you can have a look at is in the winter, if there are any remaining stems, unlike hemlock or giant hogweed, where the previous stems from the previous year are quite rigid, the hemlock water dropwort is quite flat and doesn't have that rigidity. So the next plant we're going to have a look at is floating pennywort. Now, floating pennywort is an aggressive mat-forming water umbellifer. It's quite common in the south and the southeast of England, but is rapidly spreading north and west. And it grows from the water surface margins into the body of the water. So it's growing from the margins out into the body of the water, and can spread by small root fragments. So it's a really good example of where we need to have really good biosecurity, because if you've done a site visit, you really must make sure that you've cleaned your boots off very carefully. And so, as can be seen in that image there, it can form these really dense mats of thick vegetation. And once it gets going, it can grow maybe up to 20 centimeters a day. And that has a massive impact on the amenity habitat value of water bodies. And obviously there's a flood risk as well. Because what it does, it cuts out the amount of oxygen or the amount of light reaching the other vegetation. It reduces the oxygen levels in the water and can also reduce the water temperature and prevent air-breathing insects from reaching the water surface. So it's really clear that we have to be aware of this and really get in there very early indeed, because it has a major impact on the native flora and fauna. So how can we help ourselves identify floating pennywort? Well, you'll find it has these circular kidney-shaped leaves, which are about 7 centimeters across, which is relatively large, certainly larger than the marsh pennywort, for example, which is much smaller. And also, you'll see it has this quite distinctive jagged, not jagged, but wavy edge, almost serrated actually. And then you have that distinctive, can you see there's a split in the leaf where the stalk comes up, and you don't get that with the marsh pennywort. And often you'll find the leaves are all floating on the surface, and the leaf stalk is about 5 centimeters long. And the umbels are really quite tiny. And you can see there in that image on the bottom right there. And they have this little whitish green flowers, which is helps you distinguish it between that and the marsh pennywort, which has the more of a greenish pink flower. And as I've mentioned already, the leaves are much smaller. So keep an eye out for this one, because it's quite aggressive, and it's really important to get in there quite early on. So that now brings us to the end of this presentation. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it helpful. For more information, you can see there are some links there through to the Property Care Association where you'll be able to access more information and help. But please do carry on supporting the Invasive Species Awareness Week, because it's clear that as people responsible for land, and if we're serious about looking after that land, we really do need to be much more aware of these invasive species. And the real takeaway message is get in there early, get on top of it really quickly, and that'll save you a great deal of problems. Thank you very much. Goodbye.